I knew there was something wrong with my garden, but for a while I couldn't identify what it was. The plants were growing well, the irrigation was working properly, and there was no sign of pests destroying anything. But every time I went to pick my aromatic herbs for cooking, it seemed that someone had been there before me. At first, I thought I was going mad. Maybe I'd forgotten to plant more seedlings? Maybe the birds were pecking at the leaves? But no. Then, one day, I decided to count how many sprigs of mint and basil I had. The next day, half were gone. And that's when I realized that woman, the neighbor with her obsession for controlling everything, the same one who made a point of measuring the height of everyone's lawn and handing out fines to anyone who dared to paint their garage door a shade not approved by the HOA regulations. Now, apparently, she had decided that my garden was an extension of her house. The first time I saw her stealing my herbs, I was so shocked that I couldn't even react. It was broad daylight, and there she was, stooped over in my yard, plucking leaves as if she were in her own supermarket. She didn't even try to hide it. After stuffing her hands full of mint and rosemary, she stood up, took a quick look around, and walked calmly back to her house, as if she hadn't just committed a botanical microcrime. It pissed me off, but I thought, okay, maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she thought she could take just a little bit. So I waited. 2 days later, it happened again. But this time, she turned up with a pair of bloody pruning shears. It was no longer a casual theft of a few leaves. Now she was harvesting. My blood boiled. I had planted that garden with the utmost care, not just because I liked cooking with fresh herbs, but because it was a relaxing pastime. And now, this woman was treating my work like her personal grocery store. I decided I would settle this civilly. The next day, I knocked on her door. It took her a while, but she showed up with that look of false surprise on her face. Ah, neighbor, what a coincidence! I was going to call you to ask about gardening. Gardening, of course. About how to plunder other people's gardens without getting caught. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. I just wanted to know if you've noticed anything strange in my garden. My herbs have been disappearing. She gave me a vague smile. Wow, what a thing! Maybe it was the squirrels, or some invisible pest. I took a good look at her cynical face, and I swear I could see a small piece of mint leaf stuck in the corner of her mouth. It could be, I replied, not wanting to prolong the conversation. She continued to give me that look like she thought she was untouchable. So I decided it was time to teach her a lesson. I wasn't going to complain to the HOA. I wasn't going to call the police. I was going to deal with it the right way, and she was never going to steal anything from my garden again. After that ridiculous encounter with the herb thief, I knew there was no point in talking anymore. That woman had absolutely no shame in her face. On the face of it, it made sense. She had already invaded everyone's life in some way, whether it was handing out ridiculous fines for out-of-line garbage cans or checking parked cars to make sure no one was 5 centimeters over the limit. She wanted to run the neighborhood, and now, apparently, she wanted to run my garden too. But if there was one thing I knew about Karen, it was that she thought she was too smart to get caught. She was never going to admit she was stealing. She was never going to apologize, and she was certainly never going to stop on her own. So I needed to make her want to stop. That's when I had the idea. My first stop was the internet. I went straight to researching herbs that seemed harmless, but had interesting. I didn't want anything dangerous, obviously. I just needed something that would make the experience of stealing from my garden a real nightmare. That's when I found the perfect answer. The plant known as Senna alexandrina. For those who don't know, this little beauty is a natural herb that has been used for centuries as a laxative. Yes, a laxative. One leaf of this, and your intestines basically declare independence from the rest of your body. And the best part? It looks a lot like mint. So I did a little revamping in my garden. I took some Senna alexandrina seedlings and planted them strategically between my real mint. I arranged everything in such a way that the leaves looked like they were part of the same plant. To top it all off, I also did a little pruning at the back of the bed to ensure that it would always take the front leaves, the wrong ones. Now, all I had to do was wait, and I didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, I peeked out of the window, and there she was, like a vulture on carrion. The woman bent down, picked up a generous handful of leaves, sniffed them to make sure they were fresh, and walked away as if she had paid a lot for them at the organic market. I almost applauded. Now, I just had to let nature do its job. Hours later, it was getting dark when I heard a strange noise coming from her house. First, there was the sound of a door slamming, then hurried footsteps down the corridor, then a suspicious silence, and then the chaos began. What happened inside I can only imagine, but considering that the windows were rushed open, that I heard the desperate sound of someone fiddling with their phone, and that, about 30 minutes later, a car sped up as if it were being driven by someone fleeing a zombie apocalypse, I think I can say that the effect of my little plant was immediate. The next morning, I went out to water my garden, pretending nothing had happened. The street was silent, no sign of Karen. Her car still hadn't returned, which meant that the night had probably been a traumatic event for her digestive system. I sat on the balcony, sipped my coffee, and savored the victory. But would she learn her lesson? The answer came a few hours later, when I finally saw her driving home. She got out of the car slowly, pale, holding a bottle of isotonic in her hand, as if that was the only thing keeping her going. Her deep-set eyes showed that it hadn't been an easy night. And the best part? She didn't even look in the direction of my garden. Finally, a lesson she would never forget. But what I didn't know was that she still hadn't accepted defeat. I wanted to believe that it was over, that Karen had learned her lesson and would never get her hands on my plants again. But of course, people like her don't know how to lose. For a week, everything was silent. She didn't walk past my house, she didn't give me those passive-aggressive looks, and, above all, she didn't touch my garden. I was ready to get on with my life when, on Saturday morning, I went out to the yard and came across something that made my blood boil. The garden was completely destroyed. Not only had all my plants been uprooted, but the soil had been turned over, as if someone had gone through with a spade, trying to ensure that nothing else would grow. My first reaction was a mixture of shock and anger. I had dedicated months to that garden. I looked after it every day. And now it was all over. And I didn't even need an investigation to find out who was to blame. Karen had tried to play the smart one, had failed, and now she wanted to take her revenge like a tantruming teenager who'd been caught cheating on a test. I took a deep breath. The first thought that crossed my mind was to run to her house, bang on the door, and pour out all my fury right there. But I knew that's what she wanted. She wanted to see me out of control. So I decided to do something much better. She wanted to play? Then let's play it straight. First, I went to the security camera. Yes, I had a camera installed right on the side of the house, exactly overlooking the garden, which meant that all the destruction had probably been recorded. And, sure enough, there she was, in the middle of the night, sticking the pruning shears into the earth, pulling out the weeds by the roots, and even kicking the seedlings as if they had offended her family. It was almost comical. If I hadn't been so angry, I might have laughed. But it wasn't time to act yet. I needed a plan. Something that went beyond simply exposing the recording. I wanted something that would make her sink herself. So I went to my computer and started setting the trap. The next morning, I spread flyers around the neighborhood with an invitation to a very special event. Community Organic Fair, free plants and herbs. And guess where it would be held? In the garden of Karen's house? That's right. I used a free website to make pretty flyers, with pictures of fresh herbs and a very eye-catching advertisement. Come and see our community fair. Get fresh herbs straight from the garden of our most engaged neighbor. Totally free, courtesy of Ms. Karen, who always supports sustainable practices in the community. Of course, the neighborhood loved the idea. Who doesn't like free stuff, right? And the best part? I made sure to put her email and phone number as the main contact for information. Now, all I had to do was sit back and wait for the show. The following afternoon, the street was bustling. Neighbors would show up with reusable bags, ready to fill them with fresh herbs. Some people knocked on Karen's door. Others simply walked around her garden as if it were an open supermarket. I sat on my balcony, sipping tea, just watching, until, finally, the beast woke up. Karen opened the door and freaked out. "What are you doing here?" she screamed, trying to stop people from uprooting her plants. But it was too late. Children were plucking rosemary leaves, a couple were sniffing lavender sprigs, and one lady seemed particularly interested in the basil that Karen had probably stolen from me weeks before. It was complete chaos. She tried to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but nobody believed her. After all, it was on the flyer, and in the middle of it all, there were still people asking why her phone kept ringing, since the ad said she could answer questions. Her desperation was priceless, but the best was yet to come. The next day, I left an envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a copy of the recording of her destroying my garden. No note, no threat, just the recording. Because now she knew that I knew. What if she tried something against me? Well, I was sure the HOA would love to see a video of their own president vandalizing other people's property. Over the next few days, she was quieter than ever. She avoided looking at me, left the house as little as possible, and, for the first time, stopped meddling in other people's lives. But I knew that wouldn't last forever, because Karen might have been temporarily humiliated, but people like that never accept defeat. She was still going to try something else. The only question was, when? Karen might have been publicly humiliated, but people like that don't know how to stop. I knew she wasn't just going to accept defeat and get on with her life. No, she was going to try to fight back. The question was, how? Days passed, and the neighborhood was still talking about the event in her garden. People talked excitedly about how they'd finally got some new seedlings without having to pay a lot of money at the organic market. Even old Richard, who never interacted with anyone, showed up to tell them how Karen's lavender was excellent for tea. And what about her? She disappeared. For the first few days, she didn't leave the house. Then she began to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. And when she finally appeared in the street, she was different, quieter, more calculating. That's when I knew. She was planning something, and it didn't take long for me to find out what it was. One night, while I was watching TV, a loud noise outside made me get up from the sofa. I went to the window and saw a shadow moving in my yard. My first reaction was anger. Again, Karen? But then I realized that this wasn't just another herb theft. She wasn't picking mint or rosemary. She was carrying a big bag and a shovel. In other words, trying to sabotage my garden again. But what she didn't know was that, after the last time, I had taken some precautions. Yes, because I'm not stupid. After she destroyed my garden, I installed motion sensors. Then, before she could even do anything, the lights in the yard came on like a soccer stadium, and Karen froze in place. It was a beautiful moment. She looked at me with a face of absolute panic, still holding the shovel and bag, looking like a criminal caught red-handed. And that's when I opened the door and stepped out, crossing my arms. She remained motionless. She was like a deer in the middle of the road, trying to decide whether to run away or pretend nothing was happening. But I had already seen everything on the security camera. Without saying anything, I lifted my cell phone and opened the live recording. Yes, because now I had proof. And the funniest thing? The bag she was carrying was full of spoiled fertilizer. From the smell, it was a heavy chemical fertilizer that would probably have killed anything planted there. So that was it? Her plan was to come back and destroy my garden again? Pathetic. She opened her mouth, probably to make up some ridiculous excuse, but I held up my hand, interrupting before she could start. This time, Karen, I'm calling the police. It's as simple as that. Her face changed instantly. She opened and closed her mouth, as if trying to find a way out, but nothing came, because she knew there was no way out of this. Without a word, she dropped her shovel and bag and started walking quickly back home, defeated. But I knew that wasn't enough, because if I let it go, she'd try again. So the next day, I went to the HOA. I arrived early and asked to speak to one of the directors. I showed him the video of the president of the association vandalizing a resident's property. And my God, how worried they were. In less than 48 hours, Karen was removed from the HOA, expelled. And that wasn't all. Previous complaints against her began to resurface. Unfair fines, rules applied only to people she didn't like. Even a case where a couple was almost forced to sell their house because of absurd penalties. She had messed with a lot of people over the years. And now, everyone wanted to see her fall. It was a domino effect. Suddenly, neighbors started sharing stories. One couple told how she stole a package from their door and pretended she didn't know anything about it. An older woman said that Karen had already threatened to call the police because her dog barked after 10 p.m. And the best part? Remember her garden? The one everyone ransacked during the community event? She sold the house. Yes, Karen gave up and left. After years of making everyone's life hell, she lost everything, and the neighborhood was finally at peace. A few weeks later, I went for a walk and passed in front of her old house. There was already a new resident there, a nice couple who were painting the facade. They greeted me and said they loved the neighborhood, and I just smiled, because now it was finally a great place to live. Did you like this video? Then don't forget to leave a comment and a like.